Hey everybody, today I'm here with Simon Ostrovsky, who's an expert on Russia and Ukraine and has been covering the Ukrainian war, among other topics, for PBS's NewsHour. He's also a documentary filmmaker, has worked extensively with Vice and so on. And yeah, it's been a great pleasure, Simon, to get to know you recently. And so much of I really wanted to talk to you for this podcast because it feels like so much of the election that's coming up swirls around, this idea that Trump is somehow an anti-war candidate and somehow we shouldn't be involved in the Ukrainian war, that it's actually, we should pull back and just, hand it over to, there's a danger of leading to nuclear conflict. It's just not really our business. So I know that you have, a long-term, profound interest in the region and great knowledge of the area. So I thought, I'm happy to have you introduce yourself and then maybe, start the ball rolling with some thoughts, and then I'll ask you some deeper questions.
Sure. It's good to be on here. I've been following you for a long time. I've also been following Russia and the former Soviet space for a long time. As you said. And, one of the things that I've noticed over my many years of covering that part of the world is sort of a pattern of behavior. Because you have to remember that Putin has been in power.
I did. Oh, yeah, we're good. Good. Go ahead. Yeah. No worries. Sorry.
No worries. You have to remember that Putin has been in power for over 2 decades now. And while American presidents and British prime ministers come and go, the constant has been Vladimir Putin in power in Moscow. And, a pattern has emerged, which American politicians aren't aware of instinctually in their bones because they haven't been around for long enough. Maybe some of them are aware of it on an intellectual level, but our election cycles are way too short for the kind of long-term thinking you can do when you're in power for more than 2 decades. Which, by the way, is not a good thing. I don't think any person should be in power for more than 2 decades because, to use a cliche, power corrupts. In Putin's case, what has happened is that he has invaded a place and then hasn't received any pushback from the international community, and then gone and invaded the next place, and then not received any pushback from the international community, and then gone and invaded the next place again. So I've been a reporter covering Russia pretty much since the year 2001. At that time, Russia was involved in its second war in Chechnya, which Putin had started. Essentially, that war dragged on for a few years until the rebellion in Chechnya was utterly and totally quashed. And now fast forward 20 years, and we see that Chechen independence-minded Chechens were wiped out so completely and so radically that you actually have Chechen legions fighting in Ukraine on Russia's side in Putin's war. And it almost seems like, oh yeah, I mean, that's completely normal. But, if you told me back in 2001 and 2002, when I was covering the second war in Chechnya for the Moscow Times, that 20 years down the line, you would see hundreds, if not thousands, of Chechens fighting and dying in Ukraine for Vladimir Putin, you would have blown my mind. So Chechnya was perceived. Is it okay if I go back a little bit?
Yeah, please do, yeah.
Chechnya was perceived as Russia's internal conflict because it was technically within Russia's border, at least it looked to be on internationally recognized maps. But in actual fact, the first Chechen War ended with Russia losing that war and Chechnya and Russia signing an agreement that said that Chechnya was going to essentially have independence, and then 5 years down the line, they were going to resolve its final status. So Chechnya had won. So when Russia invaded, they were invading a sovereign state. It wasn't when Russia invaded the second time under Putin. So it wasn't really Russia's internal issue, but because it was perceived as Russia's internal issue, the international community didn't think that they needed to do anything about it. This gets back to the pattern that I was talking about. Several years later, in 2008, Russia decides to invade Georgia, the sovereign country of Georgia, on Russia's southern border, not far from Chechnya. In fact, Chechnya borders Georgia. There was this time a lot of international outcry, but there wasn't any pushback. You know, aside from the United States and European Union countries saying that they were not happy with what happened, they didn't do anything to stop what was happening. And Russia ended up occupying, I think, about a quarter of Georgia's territory. I don't know if it's exactly a quarter, but it's a lot. And it constitutes the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Russia has permanent bases there now with soldiers and occupies those parts of Georgia and has done since 2008. And I don't believe that there were any sanctions applied. In fact, Hillary Clinton came around and decided to do her famous reset with Russia. It's like, let's start over and pretend nothing ever happened. And this is what I'm talking about, like with the new politicians coming in and trying to wipe away and not notice the patterns that have happened before. So tick tock, time goes by. Putin realizes that he's completely gotten away with occupying a quarter of another country's territory. Well, first of all, he's gotten away with wiping out resistance in Chechnya and making it a part of Russia again. Then he's gotten away with occupying a quarter of another country. Nobody did anything. Nobody imposed even sanctions against him. And then in 2014, he occupies Crimea. And then I was there for that. I was covering Ukraine and Crimea for Vice Media at the time. That time, it sparks an actual land war in eastern Ukraine because the Ukrainians are like, wow, the Russians have just taken over an entire peninsula of our territory. When protests, so-called pro-Russia protests, started happening in eastern Ukraine, they brought their troops in to try to prevent it happening again in another part of Ukraine. So now we have a land war in Europe. And the Obama administration sort of belatedly, imposes sanctions, but refuses to even help the Ukrainians arm themselves, and refuses to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. They're like, you're on your own. We'll do economic sanctions on Russia. Economic sanctions, which, Russia brushed off because the sanctions that came later after the full-scale invasion in 22, to skip ahead, were a lot more serious, but Russia even is able to get around those. So the ones that came in 2014 and 2015, they were the first of their kind, but they didn't cripple the Russian economy. So that's not the end of it. So there was a little bit of pushback, but we wouldn't even arm the Ukrainians. So the Russians at this point are like, we can do whatever we want and nobody's going to say shit about it. And so the war in Syria starts, and Russia decides that it's going to enter that war on Bashar al-Assad's side to prop up his regime. And in 2015, they reopen their Khmeimim air base. And then they start bombing hospitals and schools and residential buildings in the areas of Syria that are controlled by the opposition forces. And they're there under the invitation of Assad, and the Obama administration draws some red lines and says, if you use chemical weapons, we are going to get involved because you can't use chemical weapons against the civilian population. That's just beyond the pale. And what happens? The Assad regime goes and uses civilian chemical weapons, and of course the United States doesn't do anything, even though they promised that they would stop it. And Russia enters the war, and this is yet another signal that you can get away with anything to Putin. The president of the United States tells the Syrians they can't do something, the Syrians do that thing, and the United States doesn't react. That's the pattern that we're seeing sort of develop.
And what about Europe and NATO? Because this is obviously much closer to them. How come they're not reacting more? Because they're so subservient to Russia due to the oil and gas exports?
I mean, that's another conversation about European weakness and European shyness and just sort of desire to keep business going as usual because they've experienced this really ahistoric period of peace since World War II, and people living in the European Union in particular think that this is how things are normally. They've lived their entire lives in peace, just like we have here in the United States for the most part. And so we think that that's normal. That's how things usually are, but that's not how things usually are. Those things come at a cost. Like that peace was enforced. The security umbrella that the Europeans have from the United States, they take for granted. But I'm getting to 2022. And all of Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, the war in Eastern Ukraine, and all of that, and Syria, all of those things were signals to Putin that the West wasn't prepared, to put its money where its mouth is. And when the rubber meets the road, the West will express grave concern and maybe issue some sanctions, but they're certainly not going to, give weapons or bring their soldiers or do something that could actually cost them. And so then we get the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 when Russia's like, forget about it. Like, who cares? We're not going to pretend like we're not involved in the war in Ukraine anymore. We're just going to send our soldiers in on tanks and we're going to take over Ukraine. And they say that we're going to overrun Kyiv in 3 days and the whole country is going to be ours. That didn't happen. I mean, it took that for the world to wake up to the fact that in order for these things to stop happening, you actually have to have some skin in the game. And at the sort of current point where we are, the skin in the game, so to speak, is arming the Ukrainians and supporting their economy and, giving them fuel because Russia has bombed all of their power stations and their energy infrastructure. When you go to Kyiv these days, the whole town is a hum with generators because the power cuts are so frequent. So I guess I just wanted to lay out a little bit how we got to where we are today. And by the way, Donald Trump was, when his administration came into power, was no different in terms of he didn't bring new sanctions against Russia because of the still simmering war, which started in 2014. I think the Trump campaign wants people to think that there was peace in the world while he was president. But the war in Ukraine started in 2014 and went clear through the Trump presidency. It was happening while he was president. Yeah. And then Biden came into office and it was still happening. And then the full-scale invasion happened. So, if Trump had been more muscular, as he claims he is, and has the respect of the Russians, as he claims, then he could have gone harder against the Russians and said that there would be, he could have tried to resolve the war that was already happening in Ukraine, but he didn't. So,
what about
now we're facing a contest between Donald Trump and Harris, where Donald Trump has signaled that he kind of wants to throw Ukraine under the bus and stop arming the Ukrainians and just let the Russians finish off what they started, because that seems to be his vision of peace. His vision of peace is like, if you let the Russians win, the war ends. And that's certainly true, but why do the Ukrainians have to pay that high a cost? Because it's not just the lives that get lost in the fighting. It's what happens after the Russians take over, the purges, the Russification, the banning of any cultural expression that isn't explicitly Russian. I'm working on a proposal for a documentary right now about the religious minorities in areas of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia that are being repressed, expressly because they are not hewing to the state church, the Russian Orthodox Church. So these are all of the things that happen after the war ends, so to speak. They're happening already in the areas that are occupied by Russia, the sort of ethnic and cultural cleansing. Those are the things that we have to look forward to if we don't help the Ukrainians hold the line.
What about, so, one argument which has bounced around and become very popular is kind of the John Mearsheimer argument that actually, the Russians, rightly felt that NATO was going to encroach and, bring, nuclear weapons to the border of Russia, that Ukraine was about to join NATO, and therefore, in a way, that we provoked Putin to doing this, and it's kind of our fault in a way.
Well, that's certainly a talking point that the Russians want spread around as far as possible because they want it to seem like it's the West's fault that they had to start a war. But do you see the illogical nature of that statement? It's your fault that we started the war. The West didn't bring tanks into Russia. The West didn't even bring tanks into Ukraine until the full-scale invasion of 2022. And when they did, they didn't put their soldiers in them. They gave them to the Ukrainians. The West has been very, I would say, too hands-off with this war. We need to be all in to help the Ukrainians win it because Vladimir Putin's regime respects power, not restraint. To him, restraint is a sign of weakness. And I think the Mearsheimers of the world are advocating for us to project weakness, thinking that this will discourage the Russians from moving forward with their plans of world conquest. But it's just the opposite. But here's the other thing that makes that argument ahistorical. The troubles in Ukraine, so to speak, didn't start because of NATO expansion. They actually started because of a rather boring European trade agreement that the Ukrainians wanted to enter in 2013 before the Euromaidan revolution happened. The trigger for the Euromaidan revolution was not NATO expansion. The trigger for the Euromaidan revolution was the pro-Russia president, an ally of Putin, of Ukraine at the time, who had promised his people to sign a trade agreement with the European Union. And because the economy was in the tank, because his regime was so corrupt. So the one thing that he wanted to do in order to save his presidency before the next elections rolled around was to give Ukraine a sort of free trade agreement with the European Union that would be a huge boost to the economy. That's all it was. When he traveled to Lithuania, or planned to travel to Lithuania to sign that agreement in 2013, he got a phone call from Putin, who was incensed. And Putin said, "Don't take this deal from the European Union. I will give you a low interest, essentially forgivable loan of, I think it was around $9 billion that you can use to boost your economy as long as you don't sign the agreement with the Europeans," because Putin saw Ukraine's move towards the European Union and this economic pact as being a move away from Russia. Russia had its own competing, European Union-like structure called the Eurasian Union that it's still trying to get as many countries as possible to join. And many countries in the former Soviet Union have joined. And like I said, it's like a European Union clone economic union. So countries like Kazakhstan can ship goods into Russia without going through customs. Unlike the European Union, it's not a political union. So the border is still there. You just don't have to pay customs on the goods, but you still have to get a visa, to travel between, and you have to go through border checkpoints and so forth. So anyway, so Putin wanted has wanted Ukraine to join that thing. And then he felt betrayed by his ally in Ukraine, Yanukovych, wanting to sign a deal like that with the European Union. And so he was like, look, man, here's $9 billion to make you look the other way. And Yanukovych did. And then the younger people in Ukraine were so incensed because they were looking forward to this new shift in direction for Ukraine away from Russia and towards the European Union, because they tied their future hopes and dreams to that. They came out into the square and started the protests, which the pro-Russia trolls of the world want you to believe were a CIA plot. And those protests led to the ousting of that president who refused to sign the deal with the EU. And his ouster was the trigger for Putin going into Crimea and annexing it. So Putin realized, like, his $9 billion bribe didn't work. And don't quote me on the number. It might be $13 billion. I don't remember. That didn't work, and he was so angry that he decided to take a chunk of Ukraine, Crimea, and that essentially sparked the war in Ukraine. It wasn't NATO expansion. It was that chain of events that I just described to you that sparked the war in Ukraine. Because when Russia came in and annexed Crimea, you got to believe that a lot of Ukrainians were upset by that. So when they tried to do the same trick in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainians had already learned their lesson once, and they sent their troops there.
Yeah.
And the war started.
So what is your, I have so many questions for you. Some of them are, I don't know if you're what do you think is going on with Putin, Trump, and Elon Musk? Now we're learning that Elon Musk has been in, ongoing kind of, contact with Putin, direct contact. Apparently there's something called the Logan law or something, which he may have violated, as
the Logan Act, yeah.
And then we also know that Trump has had 7 calls with Putin, since leaving office. And, there was kind of this whole, dossier around Trump basically almost being like an agent of Putin, which some people say, oh, that turned out not to be the case because they weren't able to prove it and so on. But a lot of people say, well, actually, there were a huge amount of, a lot of evidence that does seem to suggest that, there's a very strong connection there that, what's your perspective on all that?
Well, I don't think that Trump is necessarily an agent of Putin, but I think that people like Donald Trump and people like Elon Musk are fellow travelers. They see eye to eye with Putin. They view the world through the same lens as Putin. And they believe that Putin stands up for what they call, Western or traditional family values that they believe the woke in the United States are trying to destroy. And so because, they're so afraid of the woke horde coming and destroying everything that they hold dear, these people think it's okay to go to a foreign adversary and, break bread with him and plot and plan. So I don't think that they're necessarily, in Russia's pay and Russia is this mastermind. But I think the Russians play the anti-woke card very cleverly. And so they're able to win ideological allies across the right in the United States and Europe. And Elon Musk is a part of that. Elon Musk is one of this guy that used to talk about how there would be no political bias on Twitter if he was running it. And then once he took over Twitter, like very explicitly went in for Donald Trump. So not exactly an honest guy, but people's memories are short. And so now it's like, Elon Musk has always been an explicit supporter of Donald Trump. But, he used to try to sit on the fence and pretend he was unbiased. So, I think it's without having to be an agent of Putin, it's just as damning that you will make common cause with the leader of a country that not only isn't a democracy, is turned into a totalitarian state, but has also explicitly identified the United States as its prime enemy. That to me is like, if that's not betrayal of your country, I don't know what is. And by the way, Elon Musk is an immigrant and a naturalized American citizen. I don't think you should be able to come here from another country. I'm also a naturalized citizen, by the way, but I don't think you should be able to come here from another country and then take a citizenship and make common cause with a country that has declared us their prime enemy.
How has Putin actually declared the U.S. his prime enemy? I mean, is that just an understood thing, or is it actually something that he stated, outright?
Russian military doctrine, in the documents that they put together, it actually identifies the United States as the главный соперник, or the main adversary. So, Russian military policy has staked the United States out as the main adversary, in contrast to other NATO member countries, like, in Europe, who are perceived by Russia as being satellite countries around the main adversary. So this is language that comes from their own military doctrine.
Got it. And what do you think? I mean, is Putin just sort of playing by instinct, or is there a larger, like, does he have a long-term, like, geopolitical goal or agenda? I mean, I followed a little bit the work of Alexander Dugin, who apparently was very influential at some point in terms of, like, this idea that Moscow is the new Rome, and ultimately, with they're going to take back Europe and so on. I mean, to what extent do you think Putin just and in a sense, why is he doing this?
I don't think that there's any maximum to Putin's ambitions.
Mm.
I think that some of the thinking out there is like, if we let him have the former Soviet Union, essentially what he wants to be considered his backyard, then he'll stop there. But the backyard is a concept that can really grow and really stretch. So first you start with the countries that were part of the Soviet Union, and then, why not go to the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact after that? And now we're talking about, Poland, and we're talking about Germany, and as far west as the Czech Republic and so forth. So, I do think it's more of kind of following instinct than having a drawn out plan, because I think that the way the Russian regime operates is by testing whether they will get resistance, and when they don't get resistance, moving forward. So that's what I was talking about, with Chechnya, then Georgia, then Crimea, then Syria, and then Ukraine. It's like they go in, they get resistance, and they push forward as far as they can until serious resistance is met. And they've finally met serious resistance in Ukraine. And while their hands are tied with Ukraine, I think it's unlikely that they're going to start any large military campaign anywhere else. But that's the problem. That's a problem for Ukraine, but it's the problem for the people who think that, the Donald Trumps of the world, who think, like, let them have their chunk of Ukraine and they'll be happy. They are going to use that time to rearm and make their plans for their next military advance. Because, that's what history of Russia under Vladimir Putin has shown. It's just a pattern of things that keep happening. It's like not rocket science. Just look back. This is what keeps happening. Russia's territory gets bigger, not smaller, under Vladimir Putin. And it keeps growing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, Brzezinski and, like, the Grand Chessboard had said that, like, Russia needs Ukraine again to become an empire again. So yeah, I mean, that would be a lot of resources it would then have to keep building its armaments and all that stuff.
Yeah, but that's not a good outcome, you know?
No,
Uh,
no. I'm against that outcome. So okay, but I guess so. You've been spending a lot of time in Ukraine up to now. Like you've been going back and forth. What are you seeing there? I mean, because I try to read like Reddit and I read like X and read all these different commentaries. Some people are saying that yeah, it seems like the war kind of stalemated. It seems like Ukraine just invaded a little bit of Russia. Russia's making gains here and there. There's an idea that there actually is a huge amount of attrition to like Russia's armor and weaponry and so on. That actually we've maybe slowed them down, even for like a generation. That would be a lot to rebuild. Yeah, where's your thinking about all of that?
well, I think the war has been really, really difficult and fought at a huge sacrifice by the Ukrainians. And proportionally, I think it's a greater sacrifice for the Ukrainians than it is for Russia, because a lot more Russians have died in this war than Ukrainians in simply like nominal terms.
What
Just the
what
number,
what
like the
are
numbers are in the hundreds of thousands, I think, for the Russians. Nobody knows what the actual casualty figures are because they're not really being released by either side. But and for the Ukraine, it's probably over 100,000 and maybe even 200,000 who have already died. But those are just estimates. So I don't know the real numbers. Um, Ukraine is a much smaller country than Russia, so proportionally, that is a much heavier blow. And there really isn't anybody in Ukraine whose family hasn't been affected by what's going on. And so, there is the question of how much longer can Ukraine hold out? And as you said, Russia is making very incremental advances in the east of Ukraine at a very high cost to Russia. But the issue is that the Putin regime, doesn't care about the cost to the population of Russia, to the population of young men in Russia that it takes in order to make these advances. And Ukraine, on the other hand, is a country that really does care about the cost of the war, and how they are, giving up an entire generation of young men. In fact, it's really crazy, but it was kind of old men for the most part who were fighting the war in Ukraine because on the Ukrainian side. Because Ukraine until very recently had a law that said that you couldn't be drafted into the army unless you were a certain age, I think like almost 30. So a lot of people did volunteer to fight who were younger than that, but you couldn't be forcibly drafted unless you were over that age. And it just wasn't, the math wasn't working. So recently they passed a law making it possible to draft people who are either 24 or 25, which if you think about it is crazy. Ukraine might be the only country in the world which doesn't take its youngest, like 18-year-olds, and throw them into the meat grinder, which I think is a really sort of humanist policy. But they did have to lower it because they are just going through so many not so young men. And a lot of people are dying and it's very difficult. And so again, this just like brings me to the idea that Ukraine needs a lot more help, much more help. And there's this whole idea in the Biden administration about de-escalation. And by the way, when I criticize, what the Biden administration is doing, I I'm not trying to contrast it to the great things that a Trump administration would do if they were there. The Biden administration is helping Ukraine. My view is that they're not helping Ukraine enough. And my view on a potential Trump administration is that they would pull as much aid from Ukraine as possible, because those are all the signals that they've given up until now. We saw that in action when Congress was trying to pass a package of aid to Ukraine for months. And the Speaker of the House, Johnson, was telling his party not to vote for the Ukraine aid package under instructions from Donald Trump, because Donald Trump didn't want that Ukraine aid to go through. So, we've already got evidence that Trump doesn't want to help Ukraine. He's tried to block the war aid. And I think if he became president, then that would almost be guaranteed. So anyway, going back to what the Biden administration is doing now, they're always talking about not wanting to escalate. And so they think that by not giving Ukraine certain types of weapons, certain types of long-range missiles, certain types of munitions, that this will cause the Russians not to escalate. They cause essentially the Russians not to up the ante. The Americans don't want to be seen as being responsible for upping the ante. And what has happened instead is that the Russians just continue escalating. Every time the United States, doesn't give something to Ukraine, it doesn't lead the Russians to be like, okay, we're not going to push forward on this one. So right now, Ukraine has missiles that can go 300 kilometers, let's say, that we give them. And so the Russians just fire their long-range missiles from an area outside that window. The Russians have airborne munitions that are fired from planes that will sort of take off, gather speed, sort of in the way that the space shuttle is boosted by a booster rocket, and then we'll fire the missile when the plane is already at speed. So you can add the two speeds together. And then the missile goes hypersonic into Ukraine, and it's much harder for the Ukrainians to shoot it down with the anti-aircraft systems that have been provided to Ukraine, like the Patriot missiles. So the consequence is that the Ukrainians are like, well, can you give us the longer range ones to make it so we can shoot those airfields that the Russians are firing those missiles from at us? And then the administration will prevaricate for a long time and be like, we don't want to escalate. We don't want to give you something that's going to allow you to shoot deep into the heart of Russia because we think that's going to be escalatory. And it just...
But isn't that underlying that is the fear, which also is something that I hear all the time now with Trump supporters, like, oh, Trump is going to prevent nuclear war. If we keep escalating, if we keep adding fuel to this fire, Putin is over and over again, kind of threaten nuclear. His people on TV are like, this could go nuclear. We're gonna drop a nuke in the English Channel to send a tidal wave over England.
Yeah. I don't think that Trump is the person that's going to stop the nuclear war, and neither is Biden. Yeah. The thing that stops the nuclear war is our nuclear deterrent. The people who keep ringing alarm bells about the potential for Russia to go nuclear are forgetting that we have a really sizable arsenal of nuclear weapons here in the United States that is a lot better maintained than the one that they have in Russia, and probably still works, unlike half of what the Russians are holding. And that, a nuclear strike by Russia would trigger a retaliatory strike by the United States that would wipe out Russia. That's what deters Russia from using nuclear weapons, not any one politician. They're never going to use the nuke, because if they do, it's not just the end for us, it's the end for them. Yeah. That's how nuclear weapons work. If you logically play out that argument, it ends there.
Well, there was a lot of concern for a while that they were going to use tactical nukes, sort of begin to kind of legitimize limited use of nuclear weapons, but for whatever reason that hasn't happened yet.
Well, for whatever reason, I think the reason is clear. If you're trying to take over a country, Ukraine, and you're not going to turn it into a radioactive wasteland that you can't have after you win the war, right?
Mm-hmm. So you think that even if, let's say, the US and NATO were like, okay, fuck it, we're going to go in full missiles, full army, you don't think that would have the possibility of triggering a nuclear conflict?
Well, I'm not saying that it doesn't have the possibility. There's always like a small, I mean, there's a possibility that what's happening now could trigger a nuclear conflict, you know? There's always a small sliver of possibility, even in peacetime, that a nuclear conflict could happen because somebody crazy presses the button for the wrong reasons. And, that's not great. But I think my years of observing the behavior of the Putin regime, and literally I've been covering Russia since 2001. I actually went to university in Russia. So, I've been observing Russia since 1998. Has shown me that Russia responds to force. Russia doesn't go around attacking strong countries. Russia goes around attacking what it perceives are weak countries. Russia fights wars that Russia thinks it can win. So I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, all of the bluster about taking it over in 3 days came from a place of Russia believing that they had the capability to take it over in 3 days. They thought it would be an easy win. Just the fact that they were wrong, proved wrong by Ukrainian resistance and a Western determination to supply Ukraine with the arms it needs to defend itself, doesn't discount this idea that Russia won't go for hard targets. Russia will not go for hard targets. Russia is afraid to lose. It doesn't want to be seen as losing. So, I don't think if they were going to say invade NATO, that they would go straight for Poland. I think if they were going to invade NATO, they would go for the Baltic states, which are pretty much cut off by land from the rest of NATO. They're gonna go for the easy targets. So the way you stop them from going from any targets is by making those targets look militarily strong and really difficult to take over. And for that, you have to grow your military. And I'm sorry, guys, that's the big bad military industrial complex that we love to hate on. We've got to have it because when countries don't show strength, countries like Russia come in and roll their tanks in, and we saw that happen in Ukraine.
Right. And I guess NATO is now increasing their defense budgets, like Germany and so on. They're like trying to get ready for, would they be able to fill in? Let's say Trump, pray that it doesn't happen, gets in office, the US essentially cuts its military aid to Ukraine. Would NATO, would Europe be able to fill some of that void and keep this from becoming a one-sided conflict?
I think the way human nature works is that people don't really prepare for a really big problem. They only react to when that really big problem has occurred. That's just, the reality of what we're like. We suck in that way. So I think that this Ukraine invasion has really showed that in terms of European readiness for increasingly aggressive Russia. They didn't want to spend money on their own defense until it seemed like the Russians were literally at their door with their tanks. They didn't. The crazy thing is, I'm working on a story right now looking at the production of gunpowder in Russia. And, the flip side of the production of gunpowder in Russia is looking at, how much gunpowder we produce in the West and to make artillery shells that we have to supply to Ukraine. And there's only one factory that manufactures this key ingredient called nitrocellulose in the United States. One factory that is like 100 years old, barely operates. And I think it's the same situation in the entirety of the European Union. In the entirety of the European Union, there is one factory in Poland, I think, that still manufactures TNT. And now they're scrambling to try to find ways to build more factories and more facilities and train people, but they almost don't even have the know-how to do it anymore because they thought war was such a remote possibility for so long. But now it's not a remote possibility anymore. It's like right there. I mean, if you live in Poland, some of the missiles that are being fired at Ukraine land by accident across the border in Poland. It's happened. So, the war is right there. And I think the Europeans are starting to get their act together. But it's not something that you can do with the snap of a finger. Those kinds of investments take years to come to fruition. So, we've been searching all around the world to see where else we can get munitions and so forth, and so have the Russians. And the Russians have been getting their ammunition from North Korea and from Iran. And now the Russians are not only taking ammunition from North Korea, they've actually brought thousands of North Korean soldiers into Russia at this point, apparently to fight in Ukraine. How terrifying is that? North Korea has one of the largest standing armies in the world. It's not a very big country. I think it's about maybe 23, 25 million people, but they've got an army of 1 million people. This is one of the biggest armies in the world. That's how big the Russian army is supposed to be on paper. And
I mean, I went to this, what was it called? Oslo Freedom Forum, and there was a North Korean woman who managed to escape, who written a book. And she was like, when she grew up there, she literally thought that the dictator was a god. Like that that there was not even a thought that he was like a normal human and that he could do whatever he wanted. So it's like, I think we really don't, we're so used to our kind of liberal humanist ideology, we don't really realize how intensive, mind washing, mind programming can become. Like in a generation or two, you can have people who are completely locked into completely
yeah,
fanatical opinions.
well, that's what I'm saying happened with the Chechens who are
I
fighting
get
in
it, I get
Ukraine
it,
on Russia's side,
I get it. Yeah.
you know?
And that's why I'm like, I mean, how terrified are you about this upcoming election? I'm at like the highest level of like stress and alert I've ever been, because I really feel like people are, and I don't know, I'm curious about your the journalist community, because you must be connected to a lot of like other journalists and people at PBS and advice and so on. I mean, yeah, it feels like certainly some people are freaking out, but I also encounter a lot of people, whether through Facebook or people my daughter's age, who somehow it's like they're switched off. It's like they either think that it's too late or that we're in a state of doom or that just yeah, like because I could actually I mean I read this book Unhumans that both Trump and Vance have blurbed, and the book basically says that leftists, socialists, but even like liberal Democrats are not human and they don't have to be treated like humans. And it says that Pinochet and Franco are the best models for the United States, and the way that they created these like Christian fascist societies, and like Pinochet threw his political opponents out of helicopters without any like legal anything. And so the back of the book, Vance is like, yeah, this is a great plan. Trump is like, yeah, this is what we should do. So I take this like very, very seriously, considering they've already like tilted the Supreme Court. I'm really terrified that the US could go fully fascist. I mean, that happened in like the first 6 months or the first year or two, but Musk is talking about how he wants to take control of the media networks. He's like, we'll take control of the networks one by one. I mean, even just when you have that ability, even if you don't carry out the threat, if the Supreme Court is behind you, and then they get the military behind them, they change the whole government to their people. Yeah, I'm very freaked out right now. I mean, I don't know how you
yeah,
feel.
clearly you sound freaked out.
Yeah, but I just did all the research to freak myself out.
No, I get it. And I think you're like entirely legitimate in that. I think I'm just sort of blocking it out, you know?
Mm.
I guess that's part of why I'm able to do the reporting that I do in the scary places that I do it, is because like I just like sort of tune it out and turn it off. And I think it's a toss-up, literally. I think either one of them has an equal chance of winning. I don't think I have any special kind of insight from being in the community of reporters and, knowing a lot of people in media. I literally have no idea what's going to happen. And that's part of the beautiful thing about this country. If you think about it, in Russia, people don't have that luxury of not knowing who the next president is going to be. And here we still do. And I really hope that it stays that way. I hope this isn't the last one, where we get to wonder who the next president is going to be.
Right. And yeah, unfortunately, I think if it goes the wrong way, we are going to lose that ability.
I think there's a good chance that if Donald Trump becomes president, he's going to do everything in his power to subvert the democratic institutions that we have that govern having a free and fair election, for sure.
And yeah, so it sort of feels to me that as I'm doing the research that this sort of these sort of various forces of global autocracy and authoritarianism, have been circling the U.S. like a pack of wolves. And Putin, I mean, we've obviously been talking about the military, but then also there's sort of like, the meme warfare, the bot warfare, the hacking, the sort of kind of contributions to conspiracies, and which now like Musk and those people are kind of like kind of like augmenting, sort of just breaking the reasoning faculties of the American mind, which really seems to have gone to a very large, very. I mean, I can't believe how we've landed, and how even people that I knew, who I considered like friends, and fellow thinkers and influencers, have they've completely been switched around into this like. I guess some people talk about like a sort of like it's like before the event, like people start to chill out, whether it's like Russell or Russell Brand or Charles Eisenstein or like the Washington Post and the LA Times, like either it's like not taking a side or already preliminarily taking the authoritarian side.
Yeah, I mean, not endorsing is sending a signal, right? Like changing your policy from always having endorsed a candidate to not endorsing a candidate sends a very clear signal to Trump that if he wins, he will be able to put pressure on these, bastions of media freedom up until now, because that's saying like, okay, they've basically blinked. So that means I can keep going.
Yeah.
So the fact that the LA Times and the Washington Post both decided, like, I wonder actually how that happened, right? It can't be a coincidence that both of those institutions suddenly decided that they're not going to be endorsing candidates anymore. It's like, do the billionaires who own these papers get together now and sort of plan like what's going to be best for our bottom line? Is this going to help us? Because we've seen that powerful people in the world, they believe that the owners of the newspapers control the editorial policy of the newspapers, and to an extent that they actually don't control the editorial policy. But remember the Jamal Khashoggi murder. The guy was a Washington Post contributor. And MBS in Saudi Arabia was incensed by the coverage of himself in Saudi Arabia after the Jamal Khashoggi murder at the Washington Post, because he had a deal in the works with Jeff Bezos at the time. And so he thought that because he had a deal with Jeff Bezos, that would win him positive coverage, or at least not covering the fact that he had ordered this killing. And that wasn't the case. But so I think, I watched the documentary about this, about Khashoggi, and in the documentary you find out that MBS retaliated by putting the Israeli spyware on Jeff Bezos's phone that leaked the pictures that led to his divorce with his wife. So MBS got his quote revenge against Jeff Bezos, although Jeff Bezos had nothing to do with the Washington Post's coverage of the Khashoggi aftermath. But like I said, the perception is there that they do. And I think, you know, the lesson for Jeff Bezos there is that if people are going to think that I control the editorial line, then I might as well control the editorial line in actual fact. And I think that that's what's happening here with the decisions to no longer endorse candidates.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. You know, we can just go a few more minutes. I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess some of my questions are more, or my wonderings are sort of geopolitical, or like, I mean, you know, so like, you know, so climate change is obviously affecting different parts of the world differently. And it feels like, you know, for Russia, you know, it might actually be, you know, at least for the short term, kind of a net benefit, right? Like, I mean, I was reading about how in Siberia they've been importing, this was, I guess, before 2022, importing cowboys from like Wyoming and Montana, because now as it gets warmer and the soil becomes, you know, more arable, you can have at least cattle ranches. So they're starting. So like, you know, I mean, you know, I know you said that you don't think he's working impulsively, doesn't have a larger geopolitical kind of agenda, but you know, both the fact that, you know, Europe doesn't really have its own.
Well, look, I hear what you're saying, but you know, I think Gary Kasparov put it much better than anyone else when he said that people think Vladimir Putin is playing chess, but really he's playing poker. So, you know, I think you know, obviously Putin and Russia don't control the weather patterns and the climate change insofar as, I mean, they continue selling oil, which contributes to it, but so are we, and so are the Saudis. So is Russia going to try to reap the benefits of more land becoming arable? Sure, like why not? Why wouldn't they? But don't forget that Russia's economy Russia looks really big on the map, but Russia's economy is the size of Netherlands or Italy, you know, depending on what year it is. Russia is, like, for its size and for its population, Russia is doing really badly.
Yeah.
And we need to remember that. We need to remember that Russia is like a puff fish. It projects much more power and strength than it actually has. And if we projected just the power and strength that we already do have, you know, without exaggerating, we're not even projecting it yet, in my view, then we could deter a lot of Russian malfeasance and bad behavior.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. I mean, any possibility? I mean, you know, there was also the thinking that the war would put such a strain on Russia that, you know, Putin's regime might collapse. There might be internal dissent, or does he seem to have like a total handle on all of that?
Say that again?
There was, you know, there was the speculation that all the sanctions, like Russia's economy begins to like melt down, and you know, that could lead to cracks in his regime, and ultimately him being, you know, killed or deposed, or some kind of internal rebellion within Russia.
It definitely could. We need to be much more serious about our sanctions. We need to be much more we need to enforce them, particularly when it comes to our own Western companies that are helping Russia get around sanctions. And when I say helping, sometimes they pretend like it's unknowledgeable to them, as in they'll send some technology to a third country, and then a company in that country will then sell it to Russia, and they'll pretend they don't know what's happening when everybody knows exactly what's happening. So, I mean, I think the Treasury needs to enforce export controls against American companies much more seriously, so that Russia doesn't get the technology it needs to be able to expand its capacity to build munitions. And you know, in terms of whether it's going to lead to cracks in the regime, you never know when that's going to happen. I mean, these things, they build to a critical mass, and even the people on the inside don't always know when that critical mass is going to break, or when the will of the person in power is going to break. And you know, you just have to be there continually putting the pressure on, so that when that moment happens, you've helped it come about. Because if we take the pressure off, then we know it won't happen, right? But we have to play the game like it can happen. Because you never know when you know, that sort of thing is going to pay off. Look at the president of Iran, who died in a helicopter crash. He died in a helicopter crash in an American Huey helicopter, the kind of helicopters that they used during the Vietnam War, because of sanctions against Iran, because they don't have modern, a modern air fleet over there. And because of the sanctions that have been in place against Iran for all those years. And that sort of without, much insight or planning, that just happened because of the bad condition of the Iranian air fleet. That's a result of the sanctions that have been imposed against Iran for such a very long time. So you don't know what the consequences exactly are going to be of sanctions on a country that's your adversary. But you're going to hope that they're not good, right? Because these are countries that want your destruction, and we have to remember that.
All right, Simon, I think we're good for today. I really appreciate your time. And I appreciate, so the main points for people would be, Russia really conceives of America as its enemy. We shouldn't be messing around with that. They're actually like a puffer fish. I like that idea, that they look incredibly imposing land-wise and so on, but actually, in terms of their actual economy and potential, it's much smaller. Yeah, everything points to the need to support Ukraine and not just think that we can just give that up to them, because they're not going to stop rolling on. And why would you want somebody who's declared itself your mortal enemy to just begin to keep amassing more countries and more resources? And hopefully it's Harris and Waltz in charge, but perhaps even if it's Trump and Musk and Vance and so on. I mean, Vance is just a puppet of Musk as far as I can see. They'll also, recognize that you can't just cede all of that to Putin.
Yeah, hopefully, but I think there's a good chance that they will want to make a deal that just shows Putin once again that there are no consequences to his actions.
Right. And maybe they'll want to do the same thing somewhere else. Okay, so yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess, one theory is, the Christian white nationalists love Israel so much because it's showing the model of a religious ethno-state that can just, do whatever horrible acts up to genocide on its minority population, and that could be a model for what they would want to do here, given absolute control and power. All right, what's the good news?
Oh man, you really came at me left field with that one. Well, I mean, like I said, the good news is that the wake-up call came to Europe because of what happened in Ukraine, rather than having to wait for the Russians to actually roll their tanks across NATO's border. So I think the Europeans are getting much more prepared for really bad outcomes, and that's a good thing. And you see that even with sort of right-wing politicians in the mold of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, because there is this view that the right populist leaders are all supporters of Putin.
Yeah.
And she's definitely a right populist, borderline fascist, if not full fascist. I mean, she certainly grew up in the fascist milieu of politics in Italy. But she is also a strong partner for NATO and believes in continuing to supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs to defend itself. Excellent. So that's the silver lining, is that even some of these right-wing populists are coming on board to, the politics have to stop at the border of NATO, at least, that a threat to one country among our friends is a threat to all of us.
Right on. Okay, Simon, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you soon and talk soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It was good to chat.
Gotcha.